This morning, in a small field in the Swiss village of Vatican, 15,000 people watched for priests kneel down as two bishops laid hands on their heads. It lasted less than an hour. But by the time it was over, the Catholic Church had entered its most serious rupture in almost 40 years. Because 3 days before this happened, Pope Leo XIII wrote a letter, and in that letter, he didn't threaten anyone. He begged, "I plead with you," he wrote, "and ask you with all my heart, please turn back." They didn't turn back. And what the Pope wrote in that same letter, just a few lines later, is the part almost nobody is talking about right now. So stay with me until the end, because it changes the way you're going to see everything that happened today. The group at the center of this is called the Society of St. Pius X, known as the SPX, a traditionalist Catholic society founded back in 1970 by a French archbishop named Marcel Lev. Lefebvre started the society because he rejected the changes that came out of the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. The reforms that brought the Mass into local languages changed the Church's posture toward other religions and opened the door to the modern world in ways he believed were a betrayal of 2,000 years of tradition. For almost 2 decades, the society existed in this strange in-between space, not fully separated from Rome, not fully incited either. And then in 1988, everything broke. Lefebvre did something the Vatican had explicitly forbidden him to do. He consecrated 4 bishops without the Pope's permission. Under Catholic canon law, that's about as serious as it gets. Consecrating a bishop without what's called a papal mandate carries a penalty that doesn't need a trial and doesn't need anyone's announcement to take effect. It's automatic the moment hands touch a head. Pope John Paul II excommunicated Lev and the 4 bishops that same year. It became one of the deepest wounds of his papacy, and for decades afterward Rome tried to heal it. In 2009, Pope Benedict XVI lifted the excommunications on the surviving bishops. Pope Francis later allowed SSPX priests to hear confessions and witness weddings. Slowly, carefully, some of the bridge was being rebuilt, but the core disagreement never actually went away. And by early this year, the society found itself right back where Lev stood in 1988, running out of bishops. They had only 2 left, both close to 70 years old. Without new bishops, they couldn't ordain new priests. Without new priests, an entire global network of over 700 priests and hundreds of seminarians in more than 50 countries would eventually run dry. So in February, the Society's Superior General, a priest named Father David Paglarani, announced that on July 1st, 2026, deliberately the same anniversary as the original 1988 consecrations, the SSPX would consecrate 4 new bishops without asking Rome for permission. According to Catholic News Register, Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez, who runs the Vatican's doctrinal office, met with Paglarani that same month and offered him a way out. Sit down, talk through the theological disagreements, but suspend the consecrations first. Paglarani said no. By May, the Vatican made its warning public. The dicastic for the doctrine of the faith said it was willing to open a structured theological dialogue with the society, but warned that any plan to consecrate bishops without papal approval would constitute a rupture of communion and would immediately halt the negotiations. And Fernandez stated plainly that going ahead with this would be, in the Church's own words, a schismatic act carrying automatic excommunication for everyone directly involved. The society didn't back down. If anything, they published an even longer defense of their position, insisting they weren't abandoning the Church, they were trying to save it. And on June 24th, the society sent Pope Leo XIV and the College of Cardinals an open letter along with what they called a declaration of Catholic faith. And that's where Pope Leo XIV steps directly into this story. Not through a spokesperson, not through a cardinal, but in his own words. Back on June 16th, a reporter asked him about the situation outside Castel Gandolfo. And according to America magazine, his answer was quiet, almost tired. "We have invited them, and I am still considering making another appeal to say, do not do this. Let us try to live in communion within the Church." And then he added something that tells you exactly how he saw his own power in this moment. He said the decision to go ahead is their choice. Think about that for a second. The most authoritative figure in global Catholicism didn't say, "I will stop them." He said it's their choice. Because in a very real sense it was. All he could do was ask. And on June 29th, the feast of Saints Peter and Paul, the day the Catholic Church celebrates its 2 founding apostles, he sat down and wrote that letter. the one the Vatican would publish the very next day, the eve of the consecrations. It's worth actually hearing what he wrote because these are not the words of an institution issuing a threat. He recognized in his own words the Society's devotion to liturgical life, commitment to priestly formation, apostolic zeal, and desire for fidelity to tradition. The very qualities that had made his predecessors patient with them for decades. And then came the sentence that would end up defining this entire crisis. I plead with you and ask you with all my heart, please turn back. He warned them plainly too, writing that what they were about to do would deprive them of the listenate, and in some cases, even valid reception of the sacraments which they love and seek for their sanctification. In other words, the very sacraments they said they wanted to protect. This act would put those sacraments at risk for the people they served. And then near the end, he wrote something that wasn't legal language at all. It was closer to a prayer. I pray for you because to tear the seamless garment of Christ is a sin of extreme gravity. May the Lord enlighten your consciences and awaken your hearts. That image, the seamless garment of Christ, comes straight from the gospel, the robe Jesus wore to his crucifixion, the one the soldiers refused to tear apart and gambled for instead. Kept whole. It's one of the oldest Christian images for the unity of the Church. Now, the Pope was telling Paglarani directly, what you're about to do is going to tear that garment. Here's a detail worth sitting with too. In that same letter, the Pope reminded Paglarani that for these same reasons, the Society had already been declared schismatic once before, back in 1988. A decision that Rome itself later reversed, which means the Pope wasn't just warning about a new wound. He was in a way describing a chapter Rome had already lived through once and had spent decades trying to heal. Here's what makes this so heavy. The Society didn't ignore that letter. According to a response letter published by SSPX News that same day, Paglarani wrote straight back to the Pope. He wasn't cold or defiant about it either. He thanked Leo very much for writing, said he'd been deeply touched by what he called the Pope's paternal solicitude. He said he'd hoped for years to meet him in person to explain their position face to face. An opportunity, he said, that had simply never come. And then he wrote something almost as striking as the Pope's own letter using that exact same image back at him. We believe it to be our very duty to do everything possible to mend Christ's seamless garment, torn by forces and pressures incompatible with a truly Catholic spirit. Read that carefully. He wasn't saying we're going to tear it. He was saying we believe we're the ones trying to mend it because we think the tear already happened somewhere else. That's the real tragedy sitting underneath this whole crisis. Both sides are using the exact same language of unity. Both sides genuinely believe they're protecting the Church, and they've arrived at a place where those two sincere convictions simply cannot both be true at the same time. A spokesperson for the Society, when a reporter from America magazine asked directly if they feared excommunication, gave an answer worth sitting with. We don't fear it. It pains us immensely. But we believe that the good we seek is greater than the pain that will be inflicted upon us. That's not the voice of people who think they're rebelling. That's the voice of people who believe they're sacrificing something for what they see as a greater good. And in the Society's own final statement before the ceremony, they explained their reasoning almost like a legal brief. After long reflection and prayer, and after receiving from the Holy See in the final days, a letter that did not in any way respond to their requests, Father Paglarani, backed by the unanimous opinion of his council, concluded that the objective state of grave necessity facing souls demanded this decision. Paglarani made the final position public in blunt terms. We are changing absolutely nothing in our plans. If you're the kind of person who actually wants to understand what's happening in the Church, instead of just scrolling past headlines about it, go ahead and hit subscribe right now because this channel breaks stories like this down every single day without picking. At sides and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching this from. I want to see just how far this story is reaching today. So here's where things stood as of this morning. At 9 o'clock in that same meadow in Econ, where Lefebvre performed the original consecrations 38 years ago, the ceremony was set to go ahead exactly as planned. Bishop Alonso de Galarreta was scheduled to serve as the principal consecrator, with Bishop Bernard Fillet assisting him, laying hands on for priests. Pascal Schreiber, a Swiss national, Michael Goldade, an American, Michel Puins Deceiver, a Frenchman, and Marc Hanapier, also French. 15,000 faithful had traveled there to witness it, along with 1,300 priests and religious from around the world, and the whole thing was set to be broadcast live with commentary in 6 languages, so Catholics everywhere could follow it in real time. According to the Society's own website, this wasn't treated as an isolated event either. They called it for historic days beginning on Monday, June 29th, with the ordination of 5 new priests who would say their first masses the next day, followed by the consecration of the 4 new bishops, with one of them scheduled to celebrate a pontifical mass on Thursday, July the 2nd. The site even offered attendees keepsakes to purchase, a boxed set of 4 bottles of wine, each labeled with a different episcopal symbol: mitre, ring, cross, and crozier. It's a small, almost jarring detail, but it says something about how the Society itself framed this day, not as a somber rupture, but as a celebration. Excommunication notwithstanding, every public statement from the Society in the days leading up to today pointed in one direction. Polani had said it plainly. We are changing absolutely nothing in our plans, and nothing in the reporting up to this morning suggested otherwise. And under the Church's own law, if the ceremony did go ahead as announced, the penalty takes effect the instant it happens, not later, not pending any Vatican announcement. Automatic the moment hands touch heads. And that's exactly what happened. Confirmed reporting from this Wednesday, July 1st, 2026 in Aeon shows the ceremony was presided over by Bishop Alonso de Galara, assisted by Bishop Bernard Felt, the same 2 bishops whose excommunications Benedict XVI lifted back in 2009, is now standing at the center of a new one. The 4 newly consecrated bishops were confirmed as Pascal Schreiber of Switzerland, Michael Goldade of the United States, and Michel Pouins-Derry and Marc Hanapierre of France. Exactly the names that had circulated in the weeks before under the Church's own canon law. The 4 men consecrated and the 2 bishops who consecrated them are now, by the Vatican's own stated position, excommunicated from the Catholic Church. By any honest measure, that would make this the most significant rupture in Catholic unity since 1988. Quick question, and I actually want your honest answer in the comments. Do you think the Pope did everything he possibly could here? Or is there something more you think Rome should have tried before it got to this point? Tell me down below. I read every single one of them. It's worth pausing on the ceremony itself too, because the ritual carries its own weight in this story. A priest named Father Nicholas Cadat published a detailed explanation of the rite in the days before the consecration. And according to him, it followed the 1962 Roman Pontible in full, preserving a ceremonial that's almost never seen in ordinary church life today. Before the Mass, the traditional rite calls for the reading of the apostolic mandate and a public examination of the candidates, except in this case there was no mandate to read at all, which is precisely the piece that was missing. Is the placing of the book of the Gospels over the heads and shoulders of the men about to become bishops, symbolizing that their entire life and ministry must be shaped by the gospel they're being called to proclaim? While the gospel book rests on them, the bishops lay hands on their heads, saying the words Excipiatum Sanctum, receive the Holy Spirit. Then comes the anointing of the head with sacred chrism, while the hymn Veni Creator Spiritus is sung, and the ceremony closes with the singing of the Te Deum. It's an old, solemn rite built over centuries to celebrate the fullness of the sacrament of holy orders. And that contrast is part of what makes this so heavy to watch. One of the Church's oldest and most sacred rites being used today to seal a rupture with the Church itself. And that rupture wasn't confined to Switzerland. In Brazil, the Society maintains 14 chapels across 8 states and says it counts at least 600,000 faithful and more than 590 priests. Worldwide, spread across 62 countries. At a chapel in São Paulo, 2 days before the consecration, a priest devoted part of his Sunday homily to explaining to the congregation why the ordinations were happening without the Pope's approval. He spoke of a state of necessity of the Church, the same argument used by the Society's leadership. Went as far as to say that in certain circumstances, breaking the law can be necessary to preserve the traditional sacraments as long as it's motivated by necessity. It's not by any intention to disrespect the rules. It's a useful reminder that this crisis, which can feel distant, playing out in a field in Switzerland, is actually being felt, explained, and lived out in chapels around the world. This one included. On the other side of the debate, plenty of voices spoke up too. German Cardinal Gerd Müller, who once held the very same Vatican doctrinal post Fernandez holds today, was blunt, saying that episcopal ordinations carried out without the Pope are absolutely impossible. Contrary to the will of God, and going so far as to call those responsible non-Catholic or anti-Catholic, though he was careful to separate this dispute from the validity of the traditional Latin Mass itself, which he said wasn't in question here. Around 20 faculty members at Franciscan University of Steubenville in the United States, one of the country's leading conservative Catholic universities, signed an open letter urging the society to step back, writing that they wrote not as adversaries but as Christian brothers who loved the Church. And at the same time, Cardinal Joseph Zen, one of the most respected conservative voices in Asian Catholicism, also urged the society to avoid schism. But within the traditionalist camp itself, there was open disagreement with the Vatican's framing too. Bishop Athanasius Schneider, a significant figure among traditional Catholics, though not himself a member of the society, met personally with Pope Leo XIV about this very issue, and publicly argued that the consecration wouldn't technically constitute schism, because in his view, the society lacked the deliberate intent to separate from Rome that canon law requires to define this kind of rupture. And that's actually the more sophisticated argument that's been building behind the scenes of this crisis. Supporting documents circulated by traditionalist Catholic institutes point out that for an Act 2 count as schism, canon law requires a positive will to separate from the Pope or to refuse submission to his authority. And they argue the society has never professed that accepting the Pope's doctrinal primacy and never attempting to set up a parallel hierarchy. These same documents draw on a lesser-known historical parallel. Ukrainian Cardinal Joseph Slipe, who consecrated bishops without an explicit papal mandate while imprisoned in the Soviet Union, a move the Holy See eventually accepted as a legitimate exercise of emergency authority. They go further, pointing to the more contemporary case of the Catholic Church in China, where episcopal consecrations carried out without prior Rome approval have, in a number of cases, been tolerated, and even retroactively regularized by the Vatican itself, without excommunication for the bishops or the faithful involved. That's the comparison the society leans on to argue that the penalty being applied to them today is being applied unevenly within the Church itself. An argument Rome so far hasn't directly addressed in any public statement. That background matters because it shows this isn't a simple story of obedience versus rebellion. It's a dispute about how the Church itself defines and practices the limits of its own law, and about who has the authority to decide in a moment of real or perceived necessity what can or can't be done outside the normal process. Here's what almost nobody covering this story is saying out loud, though. This isn't a story with a clean villain and a clean victim. If that's what you came here looking for, I'm going to disappoint you. Because the truth is more difficult and honestly more human than that. The society did not wake up this morning wanting to destroy the Catholic Church. From their own words, from their own letters, they believe sincerely and painfully that they are the ones preserving something the wider Church has already lost. Whether you agree with that or not, that's not cynicism. That's conviction. And Pope Leo XIV did not spend the last several months threatening or posturing. Go back and read his own words again. I plead with you and ask you with all my heart. That is not the language of a man protecting his own authority. That's the language of a man watching people he considers his own children walk toward a cliff and realizing the only tool left in his hands is prayer. There's an old idea in Catholic theology that keeps surfacing whenever the Church goes through division like this. That the Church isn't a fortress you defend, it's a family you try to heal. And everyone in this story, the Pope, the priests, kneeling in that field, the 15,000 people who traveled there to watch, every single one of them would probably tell you they're trying to protect that family, even as it comes apart in their hands. If you strip away the canon law and the centuries of history, what's actually happening here is a question every person of faith eventually has to sit with. What do you do when staying obedient feels like betraying what you believe is true? And if you're the one holding authority, what do you do when the people you love most are the ones choosing to walk away from you? Pope Leo answered that second question again and again with mercy instead of force. He didn't rush to excommunicate anyone, didn't frame his warning as a threat dressed up in politics. He wrote a letter that used the word plead, wrote with all my heart, and he ended it not with a condemnation, but with a prayer asking God to enlighten their consciences and awaken their hearts. That tells you something about the kind of leadership he believes in. He had every institutional right to simply declare the penalty and move on with his day. Instead, until the very last possible hour, He chose to be a father who begs before he ever becomes a judge who condemns. There's an old image in the Gospels of the father who runs down the road to meet the son who left him, the prodigal son. He doesn't stand at the door with his arms crossed waiting. He runs. Whatever you believe about who's right in this dispute, it's hard to read that letter and not hear an echo of that same father running down the road with his arms open saying, "Please turn back." They didn't turn back. Not today. But here's the detail that matters most. And it's easy to miss if you're only skimming headlines about this. The door the Pope described in that letter, that path of dialogue and understanding he mentioned, he never said it was closing. He said the Church remains open to it. Even after everything that happened this morning, even after the hands were laid and the automatic penalty took effect under the Church's own law, his own words leave that door standing open. That doesn't undo what happened today, doesn't erase the pain on either side. But it tells you something true about how this Pope sees his role, even in the middle of the most painful crisis of his papacy so far. Not as someone slamming a door shut, but as someone who's going to keep the light on just in case anyone decides someday to walk back through it. Before we get to what happens next, I want to ask you something. If you were the Pope holding that pen on June 29th, knowing they probably weren't going to listen, would you have written that letter anyway? Let me know in the comments, because I think the answer says a lot about what kind of faith we actually practice ourselves. So, where does this leave the Catholic Church now? In the coming hours or days, the Vatican is expected to issue a formal statement, confirming what canon law already says happened automatically. That the 6 men involved in this morning's ceremony have incurred excommunication. But the bigger question is what happens to everyone else. The roughly 600,000 faithful connected to the society worldwide, the more than 700 priests, the hundreds of seminarians still in formation. None of them laid hands on anyone this morning. None of them personally made this decision. And canon law is actually careful here. The automatic excommunication applies specifically to the 6 men directly involved, not to every priest or every family that's ever attended an SSPX chapel. Which means the real story is only just beginning. Individual bishops around the world now have to decide how to treat SPX communities inside their own dioceses. Rome has to decide whether this becomes a permanent sealed rupture, or whether, like in 1988, there's a long and difficult road back toward reconciliation decades from now. Some canon lawyers who've studied this crisis have said something sobering. That unlike 1988, when both sides still seem to want the same eventual reunion, this time feels different because both sides appear to accept that trust has broken down on a deeper level. That doesn't mean reconciliation is impossible. It just means it's going to take longer, and it's going to take more humility from more people than anyone wants to admit right now. Whatever you believe about the Second Vatican Council, whatever you believe about the traditional Latin Mass, whatever you believe about who's actually right in this dispute, this story underneath everything is about the cost of real unity. Unity was never going to be free. It was always going to require someone somewhere to swallow their pride first. And this morning in that field in AON, neither side was willing to be that someone. But Pope Leo's letter still exists. His words still exist. I plead with you and ask you with all my heart. That sentence doesn't disappear just because it didn't work today. Sentences like that have a way of outlasting the exact moment they were written for. And someday, maybe not soon, someone connected to this crisis might read that letter again with different eyes. Until then, the Catholic Church carries a new wound today. One more chapter in a story that started in 1970, broke wide open in 1988, and just repeated itself in 2026, and the man standing at the center of it. The 267th successor of Peter spent his final hours before this crisis, not building higher walls, but writing a letter that sounded more than anything else like a father who simply couldn't stop loving the children who were about to walk away from him. If this video actually helped you understand what's happening here instead of just reacting to a headline, that's exactly why this channel exists. So make sure you're subscribed, because we cover Vatican news like this every single day. And you're not going to want to miss what happens next in this story. And before you go, one last thing. Do you think there's still a path back for the SSPX? Or is this rupture permanent now?
No.
Tell me in the comments. I'll see you in the next video.